Sciences Po.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We are extremely happy, really definitely very happy to welcome tonight, this evening for one of our seminar, Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, who is a dear colleague of mine, and Pratinav Anil, who happened to be one of my former students. And I have to admit that I had completely forgotten that Pratinav used to be my student, and he just reminded me a couple of minutes ago. And we're very happy because for many reasons. First of all, as you might know, if you have followed some of our former seminars, these series of seminars called the Collège Universitaire seminars or the undergrad seminars, I think it's the 8th or 9th of this kind. We have launched this series of seminars since the beginning of the pandemic. And the idea was to link teaching and research, basically to provide you with a platform of discussion whenever one of your professors has published either a book or an article. So your professor, could really, with you, exchange on the basis of his recent publication. And so as a student, you could really basically beneficiate from a research process, from you could really understand that behind the teaching that usually the teachers and professors that organize classes with you, actually before teaching or after teaching, but in the teaching process there is a lot of research, and really to be able to provide the highest level of teaching, you definitely need to do and to conduct research. So we're absolutely happy that tonight one of your former professor on the Le Havre campus, because I understand that, Christophe, you're not more teaching this semester.
I did 10 years, for 10 years.
You did it for 10 years, and you're still teaching Sciences Po, and you're teaching so many of our university, which are partners of Sciences Po, but you're no more teaching on the campus, but you know this campus very well, and you've trained, a generation of students from Le Havre campus. So we're very happy to have actually an in-house professor on board tonight, and also a former student on the Le Havre campus. And this is fascinating, I have to say. It's I'm sure it's going to give you a lot of enthusiasm and maybe I would say develop some ideas for you in the future, whether you want to continue doing research at Sciences Po, whether you want to continue with the academia, or simply seeing that one of our former students is actually now publishing with one of our former professor on the same campus. I have to say it's a lovely, lovely story, and a very interesting, I would say, yes, a sort of a very interesting and lovely story. So tonight you are actually presenting, we are going to present the book that you've recently published at Hearst Publishers. It has been published last year. And the title of the book is India's First Dictatorship, the Emergency 1975-1977. I'm not going to say a few more things about the book itself, because you are going to introduce it to everyone. And the objective of these seminars is really to open the floor to you, the students, so we have enough exchange, and you can either raise questions on the research books article which is presented, or enlarge the scope of the topics that you want to tackle with our guests. So I'm not going to say anything more on the topic itself of tonight, but I would like to say a few words about both our former students, Pratinav Anil and Professor Jaffrelot. And I will start with Pratinav, I think, because you're really our honored guest tonight. So you are now a PhD candidate, and you're a PhD candidate at St. John's College, University of Oxford. And really, you must be very proud of it. And you are also conducting the research as a Clarendon Fellow at the University of Oxford, and you're completing a dissertation on Muslim politics in post-colonial India, which is, I believe, an extremely challenging topic. It has always been a challenging topic, but definitely under the current leadership, Indian leadership must be a very, very challenging thing. So, and you also had an opportunity to study a little bit at the International Research Center at Sciences Po, which is a CERI. And you also, you've been trained at the London School of Economics. So you're already quite an accomplished, I would say, young scholar. And we really, really wish you the best in the research that you're conducting under Mr. Jaffrelot's supervision, as well as to many other of our colleagues. And as for Professor Jaffrelot, who, as I said in the introduction, is a dear colleague of mine, and he actually, I think, Christophe, you were part of the team who recruited me at Sciences Po, if I'm correct.
Did. You were my first recruit. You were my first recruit.
I hope you're still happy about the choice.
September 2000.
Yeah, 2001 or 2, I forgot.
No?
And so we belong to the same research center, which is called CERI, as I just mentioned. It's one of the biggest research center in Europe, and one of the most prominent one. And I really hope you as students will have the opportunity to know more about this research center in the future. So Professor Jaffrelot is a political scientist. I'm sure you will agree with this. Yeah. And definitely specialized, but it's very important to start with your discipline, because you've always been, focused on your disciplines, and then looking at South Asia, India, and Pakistan in particular as case studies. And what is absolutely what I've always find admirable, truly, Christophe, that you have a truly international career, and that you have spent a lot of time both in holding really administrative positions, but also teaching abroad, teaching in among the most prominent universities, among which I would say Columbia University, Princeton University, King's in London. And I'm sure you've also taught in India, and I believe maybe at Ashoka or other university, but these I'm less maybe aware of. And you're a research director at what is called in French le Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, and I'm saying that to all of for our international students, so so that you know a little bit of the research ecosystem in France. I could give you the long list of all the publications of Professor Jaffrelot, but I'm not going to do that, because I want you to be curious enough to look at his webpage on our Sciences Po series website, and you'll be able to look at all the different publications that he either published himself or co-published, and it's quite a long list of publications. It's really amazing. So whenever we're trying to finish one book, we know that Christophe has already published 2 or 3. So it has always been very, intimidating, but also extremely stimulating. So without further ado, I think it's really time for me to leave you the floor so that you can make your presentation. I don't know whether you have a PowerPoint or not. I don't know whether you have some slides you want to share with the students. No? Okay, no. So we do that old style, which is really good. And so, and after your presentation, we will open the floor to all sorts of questions, and we try to leave you right on time, which is 6:30, 6:35 something. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephanie, and congratulations to you and Vincent and all the Le Havre team, because this is a very good initiative, I must say, to show how research and teaching are the two faces of the same coin is a very important thing for me. It has always been a very important thing for me. And we used to do that at the MA level. And my 4 courses at Sciences Po at the MA level are showing this almost every week. But to do it at the BA level is, I think, certainly challenging, but long overdue, very necessary. The sooner the better. Research is what needs to be taught, and for the researchers to teach is the best way to clarify his ideas. In fact, my next book is dedicated to my students, because I owe them so much for helping me to make my ideas comprehensible and to share them the best way. And of course, when you have Pratinav as a student, then you see that not only you are transmitting your research, but you are also in a way initiating a student into research. And to detect that at the BA level helps a lot. And Pratinav has had a rather meteoric rise in terms of scholarship. My only regret is that he could not do his PhD in Sciences Po, but that's another story. He has nothing, I mean, he's not to blame for that. Our university is to be blamed for that. And I'm not going to enter into this, but it's clearly one of the problems we have. And I'm sure Pratinav will do without that. What at least we can do at CERI is to have research assistants. Last summer, I had 11 research assistants, all of them Indian students who were stuck in Paris because of the COVID pandemic, and we did the best of it. And today, Sanjit is already one of my research assistants, as some of you may know. That's how we work. We do help the students who are interested in research to be trained in research. And mind you, I am co-signing, co-authoring articles with BA students every year. You know, this is not at all the star system you may see on the US side. We have no slave. We have only collaborators, and that's the way we work, the most egalitarian way. Sorry for this long introduction, but it was important for me. Let me summarize briefly. What is this book about? This book is about the 21 months between 75 and 77, during which India ceased to be a democracy and became a dictatorship. Certainly a constitutional dictatorship, because there was nothing illegal in the emergency. It went the legal way simply because there is one article in the Indian constitution, like in, by the way, every constitution, that made it possible to suspend democracy. What did it mean? It meant that the fundamental rights that are enshrined in Article 19 of the Constitution were suspended. It meant censorship of all the media, and it meant incarceration of politicians, journalists, trade unionists. 100,000 people were kept behind bars, sometimes tortured during the emergency. It was legal simply because the government of India bowed to Mrs. Gandhi and approved of the emergency, because the Parliament of India did the same, and because the Supreme Court of India did the same. And this is something I would like you to reflect upon, because it means that institutions do not necessarily fulfill their duties. And that was true yesterday. It may very well be true today. And this work that we've done on the emergency for us is a way to speak about today's India as well, to some extent. The thing that we emphasize in this book is not only the constitutional dimension of it. I repeat, there's nothing illegal there. But also, what was the ideology behind? Pratinav will deal with the social forces, political forces that made the emergency possible. I will focus more on the motivations of Mrs. Gandhi and the rationalization, the discourse supporting the emergency. And I'll take only 5 minutes because we do want a Q&A, the longest Q&A possible. Well, Mrs. Gandhi justified this constitutional dictatorship, primarily in the name of democracy. This is not so uncommon. You abolish democracy in the name of democracy. Pakistani generals do that every 10 years or every 11 years. In that particular case, she said, demonstrators in the street, and especially the followers of the anti-corruption movement that was known the JP movement at that time, were anti-democratic. And among them were Hindu nationalists, those who are ruling India today. Narendra Modi was on the ground during the emergency, was typically one of the opponents. And she said, these opponents want to take over power and they will establish dictatorship. So I suspend democracy for defending democracy, number one. Number two, I'm doing it for the poor. And the 20-point program that she introduced was supposed to result in land reform, to result in also house sites for the poor, abolition of bonded labor. In fact, as we show in great detail, it was much more a very dirigist, supply side oriented economic program. And the discourse that was in the name of redistribution for the poor was very weak compared to the dirigist corporatism that helped so much the businessmen and capitalists of India. And Pratinav, when he will review the social forces which supported the emergency, will give you some detail. Last point that I want to make, there is only one emergency, but you can distinguish some variations in terms of time and in terms of geography. And that's one of the major contributions of this book. Incidentally, before this book, we can claim that there was no book on the emergency, no academic book. And that's why it was such important research that we made. And we went beyond Delhi. We went beyond the capital of the country and looked at what was the emergency in the countryside. What was the emergency looking like in faraway states? And we could do that because we had archives, primary sources. We can return to that in the Q&A. How do we work as researchers for this kind of investigation? Archives, interviews, because there are still people who lived for the emergency who can testify. But let's return to that in the Q&A. Let me just flesh out this idea. The emergency was not the same in terms of time and in terms of space. But in terms of time, by 76, Sanjay Gandhi, Mrs. Gandhi's younger son, had gained so much authority that he imposed his own version of the emergency. And that resulted in two things mostly. Family planning, which is an understatement for forced sterilization of 11 million people, and what we call city beautification or gentrification, which meant, in fact, driving out from old cities hundreds of thousands of poor slum dwellers. That was particularly important in Delhi, in Haryana, in West UP. And that takes me to the last point I want to make. Not only the timing was not the same, I mean, there were variations in terms of time, and Sanjay Gandhi's emergency is more radical than Mrs. Gandhi's initial dispensation. But the emergency was not the same everywhere. There was in the epicenter with the 3 locations I've just listed: Delhi, Haryana, badly affected, West UP. And then the farther you went away, the weaker was the emergency, to such an extent that Tamil Nadu and Gujarat were not even ruled by Congress, Mrs. Gandhi's party, for many months. There were elections. It's a very strange geography, the emergency. And in the South, the opposition parties continue to rule, like in Tamil Nadu or even in Kerala, in coalition. But even when you add Congress chief ministers, they could resist the orders of New Delhi, showing that there was some resilience of federalism. And the very well entrenched party bosses, Congress party bosses, like Devraj Bose, were in a position to somewhat protect their state from the hardship of emergency. This is something that will largely explain why in 1977, when elections will take place, eventually Mrs. Gandhi will lift the emergency, January 1977. There'll be elections and Congress will win elections in spite of the emergency in the southern states, all the southern states almost. She was punished in the north and therefore lost power. But mind you, in January 1980, she could stage a comeback with Sanjay Gandhi, who was the number 2 in her party. And that is another lesson for today, and I'll stop on this. These rulers seem to be above accountability. You may sterilize 11 million people and win elections again. Well, this is not something you find in each and every democracy. In some democracies, rulers who have become dictators are out forever. And by the way, the judiciary usually is in a position to make them ineligible. Not in India. Not in India. She could come back, and she could come back because she had charisma. And this notion of charisma is a very important concept of social sciences. Of course, you know the father of this concept, Max Weber. It says the charismatic leader is above accountability because he has or she has exceptional qualities. Exceptional does not mean good qualities. You can be exceptional because you do something that mesmerizes people, that fascinates people. Wow, she did it. She did the emergency. She did the nuclear test. She broke Pakistan into 2 pieces in 1971. Well, just try to look at these ideas in today's India. Yes, he did it. He did Balakot. He did demonetization. He is exceptional, the Prime Minister of India. So he is also above accountability. Well, to be above accountability is generally not very good for democracy. And I stop there because I don't want to speak more, and Pratinav will give you the second part of the book.
Well, thanks, Christophe. First, I'd like to say how glad I am to be in Loa, where it all started, so to speak. And it's also nice to see so many familiar faces here, in spirit at any rate. And a big thanks to Vincent, Stephanie for having us here, and Sophie, of course, who is much more than a historian, for always being such an inspiration. So now on to more substantive matters. In what follows, I'll present parts 2 and 3 of the book, which ask 2 questions. First, why did Indira Gandhi declare a state of emergency in June 1975? And second, why did she call it off just as suddenly, 21 months later? So very briefly, when we're dealing with the causes of the emergency, we find 3 explanations. So now if one picks up one of the many journalistic accounts of the regime, one generally finds an account of a mad dictator. And there is an element of truth in this. Mrs. Gandhi was very much an authoritarian personality. But it must be said that penchant for authoritarian rule alone cannot produce a dictatorship. Second explanation for the emergency is what could be called a Marxist interpretation of Indian history. So on this account, it was India's capitalists who pushed for dictatorship. So faced with strikes and unrest in the early 70s, they decided to strike back. They found a ready vehicle in the Congress, which declared the emergency on their behalf. But if we were to step back from the 70s, we see that some of these arguments do make sense. But on closer examination, we see that a number of facts sit uncomfortably. So why, for instance, was the 25th of June, 1975, the turning point? So by then, there's no real threat to both the Congress and the capitalist class. Inflation had been brought under control. So we think it is obvious then that the capitalists were not the emergency's raison d'etre. In truth, they merely welcomed and supported it. So the third narrative follows from an interpretation of the emergency's immediate cause, the High and Supreme Court verdicts of June 1975 on Mrs. Gandhi's electoral malpractices. So in this version of events, the judgments were the judiciary's revenge, only the latest move in a beef between 2 of Montesquieu's 3 independent powers, the executive and the judiciary. So to Mrs. Gandhi's executive, the courts appeared to be derailing her social reforms. And to the judiciary, it seemed as if government officials were undermining judicial independence, threatening judges, offering them positions of power, interfering with appointments. And all of this is completely true. But we need to look beyond immediate causes to look at some of the other factors in the moyenne durée, as it were, looking beyond the personal and juridical while acknowledging the salience of cost. We argue that great explanatory weight should be given to 2 political developments that enabled the emergency. So first is what is called the deinstitutionalization of the Congress Party by Mrs. Gandhi. And the second is the absence of land reform. So now our basic premise is simple enough. We see the emergency as a limited conservative response to popular and elite disaffection in the mid-70s. So why did Mrs. Gandhi set about deinstitutionalizing the Congress Party? That is, weakening the party as an instrument of social change by concentrating power in her hands. So here the answer lies in her rise to power. When she became prime minister in 1966, it was widely understood that she was just a stopgap prime minister, Nehru, carefully chosen to ensure dynastic continuity and popular legitimacy. But luckily for her, the Congress's poor showing in the 1967 election meant that most of her nemesis, the right-wing party bosses, went down in defeat. It also helped that the Congress left was ascendant at the time. So Mrs. Gandhi underwent a Damascene conversion in the late 60s, declaring that she too was on the left. Remarkably, she managed to file massive majorities in the elections of the early 70s, promising land reform and more ambiguously, an end to poverty. But as the years wore on, it became clear that her socialist rhetoric was one thing, her role in practice quite another. Which prompts the obvious question: why did she fail to deliver on her promises? In part, this is because at the heart of deinstitutionalization was a catch-22. So on the one hand, it entailed weakening the party to control it better. But on the other, it also meant that with fewer patrons, the party's coffers also grew harder to refill. Fledgling chief ministers proved completely inept at seeing through the implementation of land reform. So in effect, by deinstitutionalizing the party and failing to follow through with her populist promises, Mrs. Gandhi had alienated not just the traditional elites, but also the masses. So alienating the landless and smallholders at a time when 4 out of 5 Indians lived in the countryside, of course, was a bad idea. And it did not help that with the Green Revolution, the poor peasantry had actually become even poorer. So a Maoist insurgency came to have a presence in 1/3 of the country. You had peasant uprisings in Andhra Pradesh and West Bengal, both of which were brutally put down by the state. But it was not just peasants, but also the middle classes, students, the landed gentry, and the working classes whose grievances grew in the early 70s. The landed gentry worried about the worsening terms of trade between agriculture and industry. The working classes, the crippling of the unions. The bourgeoisie, the erosion of real income. And students, the bleak job prospects ahead of them. That one probably hit too close to home. All of these strata, in some form or the other, wound up identifying with Jayaprakash Narayan's movement, which remains to this day the most important extra-parliamentary threat that an Indian ruler has faced from his people. By the time of the emergency, the JP movement had provoked the fall of one Congress government in Gujarat and threatened a second one in Bihar. Not to mention that the entire country had been gripped by protests, strikes, and popular discontent. Mrs. Gandhi's reaction then was to double down on centralization, topping it up with some state violence. The upshot, in other words, was India's first dictatorship. So much for the causes of the emergency. What explains its relative longevity? Certainly no one at the time felt that the transition from democracy to dictatorship would be smooth and last for nearly 2 full years. The answer, we think in our book, lies in the wide coalition of interests that supported the regime and the weak resistance that opposed it. So the emergency was not deeply unpopular. Early on in it, the opposition felt, and I quote one Lok Sabha MP, "If she keeps this up, we might have a dictatorship by popular will." And indeed, what emerges from a survey is the wide range of actors that backed the dictatorship. So among its most vocal supporters were the Communist Party of India and the private industrial empires, the bureaucracy and the middle class. And all of this goes to show that the emergency regime had no real ideology as such. Mrs. Gandhi was too keen to try and win over all these groups, and on their own terms at that, for her to have a serious program of her own. So the communists, for their part, threw their weight behind what they believed to be Mrs. Gandhi's progressive regime. And rather disingenuously, they also believed that she would reign in big business. As for big business itself, it welcomed the emergency with both hands. While taxes were slashed, a moratorium was placed on nationalization. And if big business found cause to celebrate, so too did the bourgeoisie. It benefited from Sanjay's gentrification program, for one thing. For another, it discovered a taste for discipline in the sense that Indira Gandhi meant it. Like in Mussolini's Italy, trains ran on time. Overnight, strikes disappeared. The proletariat and the pesky unions had been put in their place. Well, if the middle class was won over with carrots, the bureaucracy was tamed by sticks. 26,000 public servants were prematurely retired. After that, the rest showed up on time to their offices every day, duly implementing the regime's programs. Large sections of the intelligentsia supported the emergency as well. A number of vice chancellors came out in favor of it. Universities readily complied with authoritarian measures, even allowing policemen to enroll themselves as students to spy on campus activity. In effect, it was large sections of both the left and right that supported the emergency, quite literally from communist to capitalist, from former untouchables to the Brahmanical intelligentsia, from the bureaucracy to the bourgeoisie. While there was broad support for the regime, instances of resistance were few and far between. In the press, for example, only a handful of papers, such as the Indian Express and the Statesman, took up the cudgels for democracy. And in the judiciary, a few high courts did challenge arbitrary arrest, but for the better part, the courts, especially the Supreme Court, fell in line. The Hindu nationalists of the RSS marched against the regime, courting arrest in a few places. Its leaders, however, were more than willing to reach a deal with Mrs. Gandhi. What the RSS wanted was hegemony, not democracy. And democracy mattered only to the extent that it facilitated achieving hegemony. Now, parliamentarians, for their part, allowed Mrs. Gandhi to keep up the pretense of democracy by legitimizing the lower and upper houses through their attendance. As for the two strands of the revolutionary underground, one socialist and the other Hindu nationalist, both were of little account. So all in all, it could be said that the resistance proved a damn squib. So it was then, and it cannot be stressed enough, the resistance that brought about the end of India's first dictatorship, which brings me to my third and final remark.
Yes, Pratinav, final remark, okay? So we have a debate.
Yeah.
Can you make it quick, please?
Yeah,
Thank you.
So why did Mrs. Gandhi call off the emergency and announce a snap election? The most important reason we think is that she thought she would win. And this had two implications. First, it would restore legitimacy to her rule, both in the eyes of the foreign press, whose approval she so craved, as well as to a domestic audience, the press, civil society, and opposition parties. And finally, the second implication was that the election held the possibility of a smooth succession from her to her son. So when the Congress got down to the business of fielding candidates, she saw to it that 200 of them were picked by Sanjay. And so it was that democracy returned to India, as the narrative goes. But this begs the question, what kind of democracy was it? Suppose we can take that up in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, sorry that I had to interrupt you, but because time flies and I'm sure the students will not want to raise a lot of questions. So who's first? Who'd like to, maybe we collect a series of questions if you're okay with this? Yeah, please.
Hi, hello, my name is Madhaval. I just had a question. I had a few remarks. Thank you for making time for us to, to speak with us today. It's a pleasure to hear both of you speak. But I think it was really interesting, the point that you were making about charisma and how, people were not disillusioned even after whatever Sanjay Gandhi did. And I think I found it interesting because you can connect it a lot to the present, and it's just interesting to me. But my question is more about what was happening during the emergency, because I remember reading in Dr. Bipin Chandra's book, I think it's called India After Independence. I remember reading that the public was actually on board with the emergency right in the beginning. And I know that one of the reasons for that was that they were assured that it would be over very soon. But I was wondering if there were any other reasons and if you had any thoughts on the topic.
Okay, so maybe we should collect a few questions, and actually we have written questions by Anna, I think. So how did the foreign press or other nations perceive the emergency. So the perception from outside, from outside of India, the perception of the emergency, this period of emergency by the rest of the world, if any prominent perception could have been noticed. Another question, maybe we collect a third or fourth question. Not for the time being, no. Let me see. Let me switch to the digital table. Hey, I've seen someone who wanted to raise a question. Yes, please.
I'm from Turkey, and my question is, can we observe Indira Gandhi's case as a blueprint for autocratic governments when they are starting to lose support?
Okay, and last but not least, a question: what were the ramifications of the emergency on jurisprudence, on the jurisprudence of the Indian Supreme Court? So you have 4 quite big questions. I don't know how you want to divide the work in between you.
What do you? Well, I take the first 2, and you take the last 2. Right? Yeah, that will save time. Well, good questions, very good questions indeed. The first one on the public support, and by the way, Pan Chandra's book is something we deal with in our book. So you will have the detailed response in the book itself. But the short answer is, it depends what you mean by public. There was certainly some public support for the emergency among the middle class, something Pratinav has just mentioned, in a context that you need to identify clearly. You know, there have been months and years of agitation, of disruption, of trade, of normal life, a massive railways main strike in '74. The emergency was, as Mrs. Gandhi will call it, an era of discipline. And the middle class was more than happy with this discipline that did not affect it at all, but that it could, on the contrary, benefit from. Trends were on time. And also, very important, for some of these people, including Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh may be one of the dead men you have heard of, even though you're very young, because Khushwant Singh is a very important author, and he was one of those who said, I support the emergency, as an intellectual. Why? Because for some of these people, agitations in the street were at the expense of an elected government. So they deserve it. They should be shown their place. So for all these reasons, some sections of the public indeed were supporting the emergency. But it's very difficult to generalize, clearly. Yeah. The foreign press and the foreign, I think this foreign press mostly, no, yeah, nations also. Okay, that's a good point. In fact, we co-authored an op-ed with Pratinav Indian Express a couple of months ago on this very question. How was it seen? It's very interesting because you can really do a copy and paste with today's situation. By the way, our Minister of Foreign Affairs today, Mr. Le Drian, is in India for good reasons. Trade. And you don't trade anything when you are French with the Indians. It's very heavy stuff, huh? $1 billion deals. Same story there. Same story in the emergency period, you know. The Western countries were happy with India so long as it continued to buy this kind of stuff. The British government, for instance, was absolutely silent on the emergency. Jacques Chirac visited India in '76, considering that this government was fine. You have to wait for the Washington Post, Times, British Times, the New York Times, to expose the government for seeing the foreign governments opening their eyes. I have never seen the impact of the media more explicitly, foreign media, than in that particular case, because they were under pressure, our governments. And the US, by the way, were the first ones to change their mind. That may happen again. Joe Biden may well be the first head of state to tell India, look, there is something called human rights. You can't fully ignore them. But that's maybe fiction. I stop here because we are not in history anymore. But enough.
Well, so the question about the blueprint for autocratic governments elsewhere. So I think what needs prefacing first is the fact that the emergency wasn't such a unique regime as it's made out to be. So Mrs. Gandhi's self-coup was almost a repeat for Park Chung-hee's coup in South Korea in 1963, or Ferdinand Marcos's in 1965 in the Philippines. And in fact, the Filipino press censorship guidelines were the ones that were emulated to the letter by Sanjay Gandhi in 1975. So I certainly think that the emergency should not be seen as something unique in a world historical perspective. And it can serve as a blueprint just the way other regimes did for the emergency itself. Now, if you look at the coup in quotation marks that took place in the United States in January, you'll notice that it isn't so easy to emulate either. So I think the real difference is the strength of political institutions in the two countries. To take the obvious example, the United States has a much deeper history of democratic rule, and its institutions tend to be much more robust, which is why a couple of people shooting the way into parliament wasn't enough to keep Trump in power. So I think it can serve as a blueprint for autocratic governments, but again, it depends on the setting. So if we're dealing with a country with very strong political institutions, such a coup is bound to fail. And at the end of the day, you will need popular approval, as all of these regimes go on to show. Because in the modern world, you can be a totalitarian ruler or an autocratic one, but at the end of the day, you aren't a monarch. You will have to go back to the people, even if you don't do that through elections. You have to keep prices in control and do hundreds of other things. And now moving on to the fourth question, the ramifications of the emergency on jurisprudence. So I think both the emergency and Mrs. Gandhi's rule more generally, if you take a longer view of it from the early 70s right down to her assassination in 1984, what it shows is that the judiciary is corruptible in some sense, and it can be tampered with as an institution. So in 1973, Mrs. Gandhi superseded 3 judges to appoint her favorite crony, who went on to legitimize the emergency. And there were many other things she did. She undermined what was called the basic structure doctrine, which held that there was a substratum of the Constitution that no executive could undo. This was ostensibly done in the name of land reform, which incidentally, as I've mentioned, she had absolutely no interest in following through with it. But it did leave a strong mark on the way the judiciary and executive have interacted with one another. So I would say that yes, even today, it's very easy to see in today's Supreme Court how it has been politicized, as in it no longer operates in the way that Montesquieu meant it to, as an independent arm of government. So of course, all of this can't be pinned down to the emergency, because you can go back to the First Amendment in 1950 and you'll find a similar dynamic played out between Nehru's executive and the Supreme Court. But for all that, we should see the emergency as some kind of threshold after it, as some kind of harbinger for things to get much worse as time progressed. Thank you.
Okay, okay. So we seem to have two more questions, one by Shailen and one by Andra.
Hello. So my question is maybe a little far-fetched, but if you could bear with me for a moment. So if I sum up certain elements, there was basically social unrest in India with strikes, and an economy which was in difficulties. And afterwards, the primary point or target or aim of Indira Gandhi was discipline, trains running on time, which you mentioned a certain number of times. I see many similarities with the situation of Great Britain at the time under the rule of Thatcher. So I'm not mentioning the methods of coming into power because it wasn't a state of emergency when Thatcher came in, but the methods and the politics that were put in place in a way seem quite similar. So no interest for the working class, possibly increasing their unwell-being. A middle class which was kind of fine with what was going on, and from one day to the next, almost no more social movements, social unrest. Could this be the introduction of a neoliberal economy in India and the beginning of, let's say, a time where believing in the reduction of inequalities, of social inequalities in India became something which wasn't a priority anymore and kind of, yes, ended any hope for a more egalitarian society?
Aha. So I think I need to leave you with some time to respond to such a brilliant question.
Yes, certainly. But do you want to take the other one as well or not?
Absolutely, absolutely. So you can take a breath. Andres, so you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much. I remember reading in Kumi Kapoor's book about the emergency, about this idea floated in '76 by B.K. Nehru, A.R. Antole, and so on, of converting the Lok Sabha into a constituent assembly, introducing a presidential system of government with Mrs. Gandhi potentially as president for life, which Sanjay put some steam behind, a few northern state legislatures and so on. But Mrs. Gandhi ended up shutting down, interestingly, with the support of the CPI. I would be interested to hear you elaborate on that. Why did that fail when there were no roadblocks whatsoever in the way of a much more expansive remaking of India?
Great. Shall we do the same, Pratinav? The first, the second one?
Yeah.
Good. They are good questions, really. Excellent questions even. Well, I would say two things in reaction to the first question. One, the global context matters, which means that you have something like a zeitgeist in politics, you know. It goes by waves. By the way, Sam Huntington is not at all my cup of tea, but the third wave is definitely making a point. There are waves of democratization and there are waves of de-democratization. And I think you highlight a very interesting synchronicity, so to speak, you know. All over the world, by the late 70s or mid 70s, there is a wave, quote unquote, of neoliberal, I don't know, but at least a supply side oriented kind of politics and an economic policy. So that is something we highlight in the book. It's a turning point to some extent in India. The idea of redistribution, of state control of the economy will never be the same after the emergency. It will not change dramatically because India never reforms dramatically, but still, number one. Number two, the response will be somewhat different so far as the question of inequalities is concerned. In fact, what Mrs. Gandhi's emergency emphasized was for more equality. The practice was completely different. The practice was dirigist, corporatist, liberal or neoliberal if you want, but the discourse was for more equality. And this discourse will in fact gain momentum after she goes. You know, the late 80s, the 90s are years of mobilization of the plebeians. And they get something in return. They get positive discrimination. And the years 2000s, you can say till 2006, 2007, are continuing in this vein. No quotas for low caste groups in the bureaucracy and then in the university. No, never before you had 49% of the seats in the public sector for low caste groups, 49% of the seats in the universities for low caste groups. I bracket together SC and OBCs. So in fact, this is a very interesting disconnect. The practice becomes more liberal, supply side oriented. So you let capitalism grow, and the discourse being more egalitarian, it results in policies which are in complete contradiction with the first step, the first transformation. I think this is a divergence that somewhat explains the rise of BJP. That would take us, I have one full course on this, so I will summarize it in 2 sentences. What would take me 2 hours normally in 2 sentences. When you have crony capitalists, the Ambani of yesterday, the Adani of today, who are in a position to fund a party that can use religion for diffusing social tensions and the rise of the plebeians, you have populism, national populism. And I would suggest that the roots of what we see today are back to this, emergency moment. And last point, also because this is the rise of criminalization of politics. The Muslims, the criminals, enter Congress at the top. They enter Congress from the top, and they have never left politics. So that helps, of course, for explaining the situation that we see today.
Well, if I may just add one comment to that, I'm equally skeptical about the uses of neoliberalism as a category, because it really doesn't make much sense, either in the British setting or the Indian one. Just a word on the British one, if you're talking about Thatcher's war on the trade unions, it would be instructive to read a bit more about Wilson and Callaghan administrations, because you see pretty much the same thing happening except under Labour. And one can say a similar thing about India. And I have a recent piece in Himal on the myth of Congress socialism. And I argue that pretty much what you see happening in the 90s, that is often called neoliberalism, is present all along, not only in the 70s with Mrs. Gandhi and the emergency, but also with Nehru in the 50s, despite socialist declamations of the latter two. The broad point is India's always had a small state, a soft state in Gunnar Myrdal's phrase, and the private sector has always counted for a lot more than government. The bureaucracy has been much smaller than in any Western capitalist state. And for all practical purposes, I think there's not much different between the Nehruvian period and Modi's period, at least economically speaking. Probably just higher taxes back then, and that too, again, only for a small section of the people, because the countryside was never taxed in India. And coming to the second question about presidentialism, it's very interesting because France plays a big role, especially in Mrs. Gandhi's head and her family's, if not so much in the world around her. So throughout 1975 in her speeches, and you can find these in the selected speeches of Mrs. Gandhi that have been published over the years, she liked to compare India of 1975 to France of 1958. And the point was, you have the same chaotic state of affairs, and the only thing that can fix it is a sudden move to presidentialism. And you're quite right, B.K. Nehru made similar remarks when he was High Commissioner in London, calling for a French-type constitution. And you had the Swaran Singh Committee in 1976, which was tasked with suggesting new kinds of electoral reforms and even more far-reaching institutional ones. But the fact that you never had presidentialism in India, I think, goes to the simple fact that the political classes tend to be very parochial. So even as early as 1947, when B.N. Rao and Nehru were looking for a new constitution for India, the only ones they looked at were the Westminster ones, Ireland, the United States, Britain, and that's pretty much it. So you never had a serious attempt to go beyond the Westminster model, and which is why I think Mrs. Gandhi was so frustrated with this throughout the 70s, and no one has tried it ever since. Let's see if Modi does.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Do we have last question, a very last question before we close our debates? And anyway, you also have you have Christophe Jaffrelot's email address, which is quite easy because it's at sciencespo.fr. And would you agree, Pratinav, to give you Pratinav, would you agree to
Right.
be contacted by the students if necessary?
Yeah, sure. If you Google me, you'll get my email address on my university page. It's pratinav.anil@sjc.ox.ac.uk. Right.
Okay, wonderful. I'm sure we're going to remember this. But anyway, we should really definitely thank you. I have to tell you that we have actually purchased your book, and your book is available on the different campuses at the Collège Universitaire. Not only on the Le Havre campus, but on many other campuses. So Vincent, you're right. You acknowledge that I think it's about to arrive, but definitely we've purchased the book. So for all the students who are interested, you'll be able to have access to it. And it's not exactly the last seminar, but yeah, no, it's not the last seminar. We still have one more seminar, the undergrad seminar. I think it's in 2 weeks' time, and it's I forgot the title exactly, but it's about Latin America, and then we might expect more students from Poitiers. But just to tell you that whenever you want to come back, you are a guest, really, and I hope to be able to see you in person. Christophe, hope to see you soon. We do need to talk about the different topics we mentioned together this week, which is very important. And I wish you, the students, a very enjoyable end of the semester. You still have 2 more weeks of teaching, if I'm correct, and of courses, and then you have 1 week before the exams. And then it will be time either for your civic engagement program or for internship, or just to have a rest. Okay, so we wish you the best. I hope to be soon on the Le Havre campus and to meet you through the Meet the Deans and all the other meetings we might have. Okay, enjoy your evening. See you very soon, and do read this great book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Au revoir, Christophe.
Au revoir.
Nice goodbye to the new guests.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Au
Avec
revoir.
plaisir. Bye bye.
Sciences Po.